June 12, 2024, the day the world noticed America wasn't in charge anymore. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were witnessing something far bigger than another headline. It wasn't the kind of event that makes the front page with bold, screaming letters, no explosions, no invasions, not even a dramatic press conference. It was a quiet announcement from a country most Americans couldn't find on a map if you paid them, buried in the financial section of the Wall Street Journal. Saudi Arabia had just finalized a deal to sell its oil in Chinese yuan. Now, to the average reader, this might sound like a technicality, just another currency swap in the global marketplace. But to anyone who's spent decades studying the architecture of American power, this was the equivalent of watching the foundation of a skyscraper crack while the architects insist the building is just fine. Because here's the truth: they don't want you to. The dollar's dominance isn't just about money. It's about control. And on that day in June, Riyadh made it clear that control was no longer absolute. I've been tracking these shifts for 30 years, first as a policy analyst in the Pentagon, later as a consultant for Fortune 500 commies navigating the new geopolitical landscape, and now as someone who gets paid to tell uncomfortable truths to people who'd rather not hear them. And what I'm about to lay out isn't speculation. It's the culmination of trends I've watched accelerate for over a decade, trends that Washington has either ignored, downplayed, or worst of all, misunderstood entirely. So let's start with the story they're telling you. The official nothing to see here. If you've been following the mainstream coverage, here's how the Saudi-China oil deal is being a minor diversification move. A hedge against dollar volatility. A natural evolution in global trade. The New York Times ran a piece quoting a Treasury official who called it a routine commercial decision with no broader implications. Bloomberg's analysis cited market experts who assured readers that the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency was unshaken. Even the White House, when pressed, gave a carefully worded nod. We continue to have strong economic and security ties with Saudi Arabia, and we don't see this as a threat to the dollar's role in global markets. The data they point to seems reassuring. The dollar still accounts for nearly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. The U.S. Treasury market remains the deepest and most liquid in the world. And despite sanctions on Russia, China's attempts to internationalize the yuan have made only modest progress, just 2.5% of global payments, compared to the dollar's 42%. See, they say. The system is working exactly as it should. The dollar's reign is secure. America's economic leadership is unchallenged. But here's the problem with this: it's not just wrong. It's dangerously naive. Because the people telling you this story are either lying, delusional, or so trapped in their own echo chamber that they can't see the cracks forming right in front of them. And the cracks? They're not just in the dollar's dominance. They're in America's ability to dictate the rules of the game. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the most obvious red. Saudi Arabia didn't make this move in a vacuum. This wasn't some impulsive decision by a rogue prince. It was the result of years of quiet, deliberate diplomacy that the U.S. either missed or chose to ignore. For decades, the petrodollar system was the cornerstone of American hegemony. In 1974, Henry Kissinger struck a deal with the U.S. sell oil exclusively in dollars, and will protect your regime. That arrangement did two things. First, it ensured that every country buying oil had to hold dollars, creating artificial demand for U.S. currency. Second, it gave Washington an effective veto over global energy markets. If you wanted oil, you played by America's rules. But here's what: the U.S. no longer needs Saudi oil. Thanks to the shale revolution, America is now the world's largest oil producer. And with that shift came a quiet but profound change in the relationship. The Saudis, sensing that their leverage was slipping, started hedging their bets. In 2016, Riyadh floated the idea of selling oil in yuan. The U.S. dismissed it as a bluff. In 2018, China and Saudi Arabia signed a currency swap agreement, allowing them to bypass the dollar in bilateral trade. Washington yawned. In 2020, the Saudis joined China's cross-border interbank payment system, a direct challenge to SWIFT. The State Department called it a technicality. And then, in 2024, they did it. They actually did it. Now, let's talk about the numbers. The Wall Street Journal reported that the initial yuan-denominated oil sales would be modest, just a few $billions worth. But here's the thing about geopolitical: they don't happen all at once. They happen in stages. The first stage is always the hardest. The second is easier. And by the third, it's irreversible. China isn't just buying Saudi oil in yuan. It's doing the same with Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and Angola. And it's not just oil. Beijing is pushing for yuan settlement in iron ore, copper, soybeans, commodities that form the backbone of global trade. The more countries that adopt this system, the less they need the dollar. And the less they need the dollar, the less power Washington has to enforce its will. But the real kicker? The Saudis didn't do this alone. They had help. And that help came from a source that should make every American policymaker lose: Russia. Here's what you won't read in the New York Times: in the months leading up to the Saudi-China deal, there were secret high-level meetings between Russian and Saudi officials. The topic? How to accelerate de-dollarization in the Middle East. Moscow, fresh off its own successful pivot away from the dollar after Western sanctions, was more than happy to share its playbook. And the Saudis? They were eager students. This wasn't just about economics. It was about power. And the message was: if you want to survive in the New World Order, you can't rely on America anymore. The bigger America's unipolar moment is over. Let's out for a moment. Because this isn't just about Saudi Arabia. It's about the end of an era. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under a simple but intoxicating: we are the indispensable nation. The world runs on our rules. And if anyone challenges that, we'll make them regret it. That assumption was the foundation of what scholars call liberal hegemony, the idea that America could, and should, reshape the world in its own image through military force, economic coercion, and ideological pressure. It's the logic that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. It's the logic that justified NATO action, color revolutions, and regime change operations from Caracas to Tehran. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was still poor. The Middle East was a playground for American power. The dollar reigned supreme. The US could sanction entire countries out of existence, and the world had no choice but to comply. But here's the hard that world is gone. What we're witnessing now is the collapse of unipolarity, the slow, grinding death of the idea that America can dictate outcomes everywhere, all the time. And the forces driving this shift aren't just economic. They're geopolitical, technological, and ideological. Let's break it down. 1. The rise of the multipolar order. For decades, the US treated Russia and China as secondary powers, annoying, but ultimately manageable. That delusion is over. Russia has survived Western sanctions, rebuilt its military, and turned the tables on NATO and Ukraine. It's not the Soviet Union, but it's no longer a country that can be ignored or bullied. And crucially, it's found a partner in China that shares its vision of a world where America doesn't get to make all the rules. China isn't just an economic competitor anymore. It's a civilizational state with its own vision of global order, one that doesn't include American hegemony. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Action, these aren't just economic projects. They're alternative institutions designed to replace the US-led system. The Global South is no longer a passive observer. Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia are playing the great powers off each other, extracting concessions, and refusing to pick sides. They see the writing on the West's dominance is fading, and they want a seat at the new table. This isn't some abstract academic debate. It's happening right now. And the Saudi-China oil deal? That's just the latest domino to fall. 2. The weaponization of the dollar has backfired. Here's where American policymakers made their biggest mistake. They thought they could use the dollar as a weapon, freezing Russian assets, kicking Iran out of SWIFT, sanctioning half the world, and that no one would dare challenge them. They were wrong. Every time the US weaponizes the dollar, it accelerates the search for alternatives. Russia and China have spent the last decade building parallel financial systems. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks, they've all watched what happened to Moscow, and that could be us. And now, they're acting. Russia has shifted 80% of its trade with China to rubles and yuan. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. Brazil is settling trade with China in yuan. The UAE has launched a dirham-yuan swap line. Even France, America's oldest ally, has started settling LNG trades with China in yuan. This isn't a blip. It's a trend. And the more the US doubles down on sanctions, the faster the trend accelerates. 3. The military. Why America can't bomb its way out of this. Now, here's where the hawks in Washington will chime. If the dollar's losing its edge, we'll just remind the world who's boss. A few airstrikes here, a carrier strike group there, and everyone will fall back in line. Let me stop you right there. Because military power is not the same as control. And the idea that America can bomb its way to dollar dominance is one of the most dangerous delusions in Washington today. Let's look at the US military is stretched thin. Between Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and Africa, American forces are deployed in more places than at any point since World War II. And yet, in every theater, we're losing leverage. Our adversaries have adapted. Russia has built an anti-access/area denial bubble in Eastern Europe that makes large-scale NATO operations nearly impossible. China's missile arsenal can sink a US carrier from 1,500 miles away. Iran's proxy networks can strike American bases across the Middle East with impunity. The public won't tolerate endless war. After Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans are done with forever wars. And the political class knows it. That's why you see even the most hawkish politicians avoiding direct confrontation with Russia or China. But here's the real: even if the US could win a war, it wouldn't solve the problem. Let's say Washington decided to punish Saudi Arabia for its yuan oil sales. What happens next? Oil prices spike. Gas hits $6 a gallon. Inflation soars. The Fed has to raise rates. The economy tanks. And who gets blamed? The president. China steps in. Beijing offers Riyadh security guarantees in exchange for deeper economic ties. The Saudis, already hedging their bets, accept. The rest of the Gulf follows. The UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, they all see the writing on the wall. If Saudi Arabia can defy Washington and survive, why can't they? This isn't speculation. It's history. We've seen this movie before. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq to secure the oil. Result? China became Iraq's biggest customer. In 2011, the US toppled Gaddafi to protect Libyan democracy. Result? Russia and China now dominate Libya's oil fields. In 2014, the US sanctioned Russia over Crimea. Result? Moscow pivoted to China, and the two now have a no-limits partnership. Military power is a tool, not a strategy. And right now, America is trying to use a hammer to fix a problem that requires a scalpel. The domestic political why Washington can't change course. Now, let's talk about the real reason America is losing domestic politics. Because here's the dirty little secret of US foreign: it's not about grand strategy. It's about elections. And right now, the incentives are all wrong. 1. The two-party consensus on empire. For all their differences, Democrats and Republicans agree on one: America must remain the world's sole superpower. The only debate is how. Democrats want to maintain dominance through economic coercion, alliances, and soft power. Sanctions, NATO action, rules-based order. Republicans prefer military force, unilateralism, and peace through strength. Carrier strike groups, regime change, America first bluster. But here's the: neither approach works anymore. Sanctions? They're backfiring. The more the US weaponizes the dollar, the faster the world builds alternatives. Alliances? They're fraying. Europe is dependent on Russian energy. Japan and South Korea are hedging on China. Even Israel is cozying up to Beijing. Military force? It's too expensive, too risky, and too unpopular. And yet, no one in Washington can admit this. Because to do so would be to admit that the entire post-Cold War strategy was a failure. 2. The swing state trap. Here's where things get really ugly. Because even if a president wanted to change course, they'd face immediate political backlash. Let's take 2024 as an example. The election is a coin flip between Biden and Trump. And both candidates know that foreign policy is a losing issue unless they can frame it as strength. Biden needs to prove he's tough on China to win over working-class voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan. So he escalates tensions, tariffs, export controls, military drills near Taiwan. Trump needs to prove he's tougher than Biden to win over the MAGA base. So he promises to bomb Iran, crush China, and end the wars. Neither candidate can afford to look weak. So neither can afford to pursue diplomacy. And the result? A foreign policy that's all sticks, no carrots. A strategy that accelerates the very trends it's trying to stop. 3. The blob strikes back. And then there's the blob, the foreign policy establishment that thrives on crisis. Think tanks need new threats to justify their funding. Defense contractors need new enemies to sell weapons. Bureaucrats need new missions to keep their jobs. So what do? They manufacture consent for endless conflict. China is the new Soviet Union. Russia is Hitler 2.0. Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. And the media? They lap it up. Because fear sells. But here's the blob doesn't care about winning. It cares about perpetuating the system. And right now, that system is failing. Where do we go from here? So where does this leave us? Let's run through the 3 most likely scenarios, none of them good. Scenario 1, the soft landing. In this best-case scenario, the US wakes up and realizes that hegemony is unsustainable. Washington pivots to great power management, accepting a multipolar world, negotiating spheres of influence, and focusing on economic and technological competition rather than military dominance. The dollar remains dominant, but not exclusive. The yuan and euro gain ground, but the US adapts. NATO and US alliances remain intact, but with clearer red lines, no more action into Russia's backyard, no more regime change wars. China and Russia are contained, but not crushed. The US competes economically, but avoids direct conflict. Why it won't? Because it requires political courage, something in short supply in Washington. The blob would fight it tooth and nail. The media would scream appeasement. And the public? They'd vote out anyone who tried. Scenario 2, the slow decline. This is the most likely outcome. The US refuses to adapt, but can't enforce its will. The result? A slow, grinding erosion of American power. The dollar's dominance fades, but not overnight. Countries hedge their bets, but don't fully abandon the greenback. Alliances weaken. Europe drifts toward strategic autonomy. The Middle East balances between East and West. Asia becomes a multipolar battleground. Mail. Atari budgets remain bloated, but the returns diminish. The US spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, $877 billion in 2022, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, but the gap between spending and capability widens. The F-35 program, a $1.7 trillion boondoggle, is a perfect example. It's supposed to be the backbone of American air power, but it's plagued by delays, cost overruns, and performance issues. Meanwhile, China's J-20 stealth fighter is already operational, and Russia's Su-57 is closing the gap. The US is still ahead, but the margin is shrinking, and the cost of maintaining the lead is becoming unsustainable. Now, what most people don't realize is that this slow decline isn't just about money. It's about the erosion of deterrence. The US has built its post-Cold War strategy on the idea that no one would dare challenge American military supremacy. But that assumption is being tested every day. In 2020, China's military budget was just 36% of America's. By 2023, it was 43%. That might not sound like much, But when you consider that China's economy is growing faster and its military is focused on asymmetrical capabilities, hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, anti-satellite weapons, the balance shifts. The US can still project power globally, but it's no longer invincible. And that changes everything. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still the strongest military power in the world, but it's no longer the only one that matters. Russia's war in Ukraine has shown that even a second-tier power can bog down a superpower in a protracted conflict. China's military modernization is turning the Taiwan Strait into a potential flashpoint where the US might not have the upper hand. And let's not forget Iran, which has spent decades developing proxy networks and asymmetric capabilities to counter American influence in the Middle East. The US can still win wars, but it can't win them all at once. And that's a problem when you're trying to maintain a global empire. Scenario 3, the hard crash. This is the nightmare scenario. The US refuses to adapt, overreaches, and triggers a catastrophic failure. It could happen in a few ways. First, Taiwan. If China invades, the US will face an impossible intervene and risk a direct war with a nuclear-armed great power, or stand by and watch its credibility collapse. Either way, the consequences are dire. A war over Taiwan would disrupt global supply chains, trigger a financial crisis, and force countries to pick sides. The US might win militarily, but it would lose economically and politically. Second, the Middle East. The US has spent decades trying to control the region, but its influence is waning. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon or even comes close, the US will face pressure to strike. But a war with Iran would be a quagmire, and it could drag in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other regional players. The result? A wider conflict that the US can't contain. Third, the dollar. The US has weaponized the dollar through sanctions, but every time it does, it pushes countries to find alternatives. If Saudi Arabia starts selling oil in yuan, or if China and Russia create a viable alternative to SWIFT, the dollar's dominance could unravel faster than anyone expects. And when that happens, the US loses its most powerful tool of coercion. Let me explain why this matters. The US has built its entire global strategy on the assumption that it can outspend, out-innovate, and outfight any rival. But that strategy is based on a unipolar moment that no longer exists. The world is multipolar now, and the US is struggling to adapt. The blob, the foreign policy establishment, still acts as if America can dictate terms to the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is no longer listening. Take NATO, for example. The alliance was supposed to be a bulwark against Russia, but after the Cold War, it exited eastward, provoking Moscow. Now, Russia is weaker than it was in the 1990s, but it's also more dangerous because it feels cornered. The US has spent billions arming Ukraine, but for what? To weaken Russia? To send a message to China? The goals are unclear, and the costs are mounting. Meanwhile, Europe is waking up to the fact that it can't rely on the US forever. France's Emmanuel Macron has talked about strategic autonomy. Germany is rearming. Even Poland, the most hawkish of US allies, is hedging its bets. Now, let's talk about the military implications. The US has built its defense strategy around forward deployment bases in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But those bases are vulnerable. China's hypersonic missiles can strike Guam. Russia's Caliber missiles can hit targets in Europe. Iran's drones and ballistic missiles can threaten US forces in the Persian Gulf. The US can still project power, but it's no longer invulnerable. And that changes the calculus for allies. Why should Japan or South Korea rely on the US if Washington can't guarantee their security? Here's the US is still the only country that can project power globally, but it's no longer the only country that can deny power to others. China's anti-access/area denial capabilities in the South China Sea mean that the US can't operate freely in its backyard. Russia's electronic warfare and air defenses in Ukraine have neutralized some of NATO's technological advantages. Iran's proxy networks in the Middle East mean that the US can't strike without risking retaliation. The US is still the strongest, but it's no longer the only game in town. So what does this mean for the future? It means that the US is entering a period of strategic vulnerability. The blob will try to paper over the cracks with more spending, more sanctions, more military interventions. But that's not a strategy, it's a recipe for disaster. The US needs to accept that it can't control everything. It needs to prioritize. It needs to focus on what matters most, protecting its core interests, deterring great power conflict, and maintaining its economic and technological edge. But here's the blob doesn't do priorities. It does everything. It wants to contain China, deter Russia, stabilize the Middle East, and maintain global dominance. And it wants to do it all at once. That's not strategy, that's hubris. And hubris is how empires fall. The question is, will the US learn from history, or will it repeat the mistakes of the past? The signs aren't encouraging. The blob is still in charge, and the blob doesn't do introspection. It does more of the same. And that's why I'm worried. Because the US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's no longer the most adaptable. And in a multipolar world, adaptability is what matters most. Now, what most people don't realize is that this strategic overreach isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic one. The blob doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's sustained by a political class that has convinced itself that America's global dominance is both inevitable and non-negotiable. And that's where the real danger lies. Because when a country's elites are more invested in maintaining their own power than in adapting to reality, the system becomes brittle. And brittle systems break. Let me explain why this matters. The US political system was designed for deliberation, not for decisive action in a multipolar world. The Constitution's checks and balances were meant to prevent tyranny, not to enable paralysis. But today, those same mechanisms are being weaponized by a political establishment that would rather cling to outdated strategies than risk the discomfort of change. Take the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, $886 billion in military spending, the largest in history, and yet it does nothing to address the fundamental mismatch between America's global commitments and its actual capabilities. The Pentagon wants more ships, more planes, more bases, but it can't even pass an audit. The last time it did was, well, never. And yet Congress keeps writing blank checks, because no one wants to be the one who says, maybe we can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is suffering from a crisis of strategic solvency. The numbers don't lie. The national debt is $34 trillion and climbing. Interest payments on that debt are now the fastest growing federal expenditure, $1 trillion a year by 2026, according to the Congressional Budget Office. That's more than the US spends on defense. And yet, the blob solution is always the more spending, more borrowing, more of the same. It's like a family maxing out its credit cards to keep up appearances at the country club while the roof collapses. At some point, the bill comes due. But the problem isn't just fiscal, it's political. The American public is exhausted. A 2023 Pew Research poll found that 70% of Americans believe the US should focus on its own problems rather than playing a leading role in the world. That's not isolationism, that's common sense. And yet, the blob dismisses this as naive populism, as if the only alternative to global hegemony is surrender. That's a false choice, and a dangerous one. The real question isn't whether America should retreat from the world, it's whether it can afford to keep pretending it can do everything, everywhere, all at once. Now, let's talk about the scenarios. Because this isn't just about abstract strategy, it's about what happens when the system finally cracks under the strain. There are three plausible paths forward, and none of them are pretty. The first is managed decline. This is the blob's preferred outcome: a slow, controlled retrenchment where the US gradually reduces its commitments while maintaining the illusion of leadership. Think of it as the British Empire after World War, still a major power, but no longer the center of gravity. The problem with this scenario is that the blob has no incentive to manage anything. It's far easier to keep kicking the can down the road, even if that means a harder fall later. And let's be honest, America isn't Britain. The US doesn't have a centuries-old empire to dismantle. It has a global network of alliances, bases, and obligations that were built for a unipolar world. Unwinding that without chaos is like defusing a bomb with a butter knife. The second scenario is strategic shock. This is what happens when the system breaks suddenly, a major crisis that forces a reckoning. It could be a war in the Taiwan Strait that goes badly. It could be a financial meltdown triggered by unsustainable debt. It could be a domestic political crisis that paralyzes the government at a critical moment. The point is, the US isn't prepared for any of these. The Pentagon's own wargames have shown that in a conflict with China over Taiwan, the US could lose thousands of troops and dozens of ships in a matter of weeks. And yet, the blob's response is to double down on the same strategies that led to those grim outcomes. That's not resilience, that's denial. The third scenario is the most strategic overreach leading to collapse. This is the Roman Empire path, a slow, grinding erosion of power until the center can no longer hold. The US isn't Rome, but the parallels are worth considering. Rome's decline wasn't caused by a single catastrophe, it was the result of overextension, internal decay, and the inability to adapt. The US today is facing a political class that's more interested in power than governance, an economy that's increasingly hollowed out by financialization, and a military that's stretched thin by endless wars. The difference is that Rome didn't have nuclear weapons. The stakes are higher now. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, in my view, is a messy combination of all three scenarios. The US will try to muddle through, but the cracks will keep widening. There will be moments of clarity, brief periods where the political class recognizes the need for change, but they'll be followed by backsliding, because the blob's incentives are misaligned with reality. The 2024 election is a perfect example. Both major parties are offering variations of the same failed policies. The Republicans want more military spending and more confrontation with China. The Democrats want more military spending and more confrontation with Russia. Neither side is asking the hard what are America's core interests. What can it realistically defend? What is it willing to sacrifice? Let me be, I'm not predicting the end of America. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, and it will remain so for decades. But power isn't just about capabilities, it's about will. And right now, the US is running on fumes. The will to sustain global dominance is fading, but the political class is too invested in the status quo to admit it. That's a recipe for disaster. The question is whether the system can adapt before it's too late. History suggests that empires don't go quietly. They cling to power until the very end, even as the foundations crumble beneath them. The British Empire did it. The Soviet Union did it. And unless something changes, the US will do it too. The difference is that when America falls, it won't just be a regional power, it will be the anchor of the global order. And that's why this matters. Because the world can't afford an American collapse. But it also can't afford an America that refuses to change. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about America's internal decay, it's about the fundamental mismatch between the world as it is and the world as Washington still imagines it. The US foreign policy establishment operates on autopilot, recycling the same playbook from the 1990s, ex NATO, contain China, dominate the Middle East, and pretend that military primacy is the same thing as strategic solvency. But the world has moved on. The unipolar moment is over, and the sooner America's leaders accept that, the better. The problem isn't that other powers are rising, it's that the US is still acting as if it can dictate the terms of their rise. Take China, for example. The Biden administration's approach, decoupling, export controls, military encirclement, assumes that Beijing can be economically strangled into submission. But China isn't the Soviet Union. It's the world's largest trading nation, the top trading partner for over 120 countries, and the manufacturing hub for everything from iPhones to solar cells. The US can try to slow China down, but it can't stop it without inflicting massive collateral damage on itself and its allies. The semiconductor war is a perfect case study. The CHIPS Act and export bans on advanced chips were supposed to kneecap China's tech sector, but all they've done is accelerate Beijing's push for self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, US chipmakers like Nvidia are losing billions in potential revenue, and Taiwan, home to TSMC, the world's most advanced chip foundry, is caught in the crossfire. The uncomfortable truth is that the US is trying to wage economic warfare on a country that holds over $800 billion in US Treasury bonds. That's not strategy, that's a hostage situation. Then there's Europe. For decades, the US has treated NATO as a one-way street, a security guarantee with no real obligations for its allies. But Europe is waking up to the fact that America's priorities are shifting. The war in Ukraine was supposed to be NATO's finest hour, but instead, it's exposed the alliance's deep fractures. Germany is rearming, but it's still dependent on US leadership. France talks about strategic autonomy, but it's too busy selling arms to India and the Gulf states to build a real European defense capability. And Eastern Europe? They're still trapped in the Cold War mindset, begging for more US troops and more sanctions on Russia, even as their economies suffer. The US can't keep pretending that Europe is a reliable partner when it's still addicted to Russian energy and American protection. If Washington wants a strong Europe, it needs to stop treating it like a vassal and start treating it like a peer. That means letting go of the reins, even if it means Europe makes mistakes along the way. Here's the America's grand strategy isn't just failing because it's poorly executed. It's failing because it's based on a fundamental misreading of the 21st century. The US still thinks in terms of hegemony, of being the indispensable nation, the global policeman, the final arbiter of international order. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. Power is diffusing, not just to China and Russia, but to regional blocs like the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and even middle powers like Turkey, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. These countries aren't lining up to join America's camp. They're hedging their bets, playing Washington and Beijing off each other, and building their own spheres of influence. The US can either adapt to this reality or keep pretending it can turn back the clock. So what are the alternatives? The first option is retrenchment, a deliberate, strategic withdrawal from global overreach. That doesn't mean isolationism. It means focusing on core defending the homeland, securing critical supply chains, and maintaining a balance of power in key regions like East Asia and the Middle East. It means accepting that the US can't be everywhere at once and that some conflicts, like Ukraine, aren't existential threats. It means letting allies like South Korea, and Germany take more responsibility for their own defense. And it means negotiating with adversaries from a position of strength, not weakness. The Iran nuclear deal was flawed, but it was a step in the right direction. The alternative, endless sanctions and covert ops, has only made Iran more dangerous. The second option is a new grand bargain, a concert of powers where the US, China, and other major states agree to manage competition without catastrophe. This isn't about kumbaya diplomacy. It's about recognizing that in a multipolar world, great powers have to coexist, even if they don't trust each other. The US and China will never be allies, but they don't have to be enemies. The goal should be to prevent war, not to win it. That means arms control agreements, crisis hotlines, and rules of the road for cyber in space. It means accepting that Taiwan is a flashpoint, not a cause for war, and that the status quo, however imperfect, is better than a conflict that could kill millions. It means acknowledging that Russia, for all its brutality, is a permanent part of the European security equation, and that NATO action has limits. The third option is the most, doubling down on the status quo. That's the path we're on now. More military spending, more sanctions, more regime change fantasies. The problem with this approach is that it assumes America's decline is reversible, that if we just try harder, we can restore the unipolar moment. But that moment is gone. The US can still be a great power, but it can't be the sole superpower. The longer Washington clings to that illusion, the worse the reckoning will be. Let me be, none of these options are easy. Retrenchment means admitting failure, which no politician wants to do. A grand bargain means compromising with adversaries, which the blob will call appeasement. And doubling down means risking catastrophe, which is what got us into this mess in the first place. But the alternative, muddling through until the system collapses, is worse. The US has to manage its decline or accelerate it. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The British Empire didn't fall because it lost a war. It fell because it couldn't adapt to a world where it was no longer the center of gravity. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of Reagan's military buildup. It collapsed because it was a hollowed-out shell, propped up by ideology and fear. America isn't there yet, but the warning signs are flashing red. The question isn't whether the US can avoid decline. It's whether it can avoid a catastrophic fall. The stakes couldn't be higher. If America stumbles, the world doesn't just get a new hegemon. It gets chaos. A global order without a stabilizer is a global order where regional powers fight proxy wars, where nuclear proliferation accelerates, and where economic fragmentation deepens. That's not a world anyone should want. But it's the world we're heading toward if the US can't break free from its own myths. So what's the way forward? It starts with honesty. The American people need to understand that the era of unchallenged dominance is over. The political class needs to stop pretending that more of the same will fix the problem. And the foreign policy establishment needs to accept that the world has changed, and that America's role in it must change too. That doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. The US still has a dynamic economy, a resilient society, and a military that, for all its flaws, is still the most capable in the world. But strength without wisdom is just power waiting to be squandered. The challenge isn't just to preserve America's position in the world. It's to redefine it. And that starts with asking what kind of power does America want to be? What kind of world does it want to live in? And what is it willing to give up to get there? The answers won't be easy. But they're necessary. Because the alternative isn't just decline. It's disaster.